The blizzard came in without warning, swallowing the jagged ice plains of Virella 7 in waves of white. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The temperature plummeted to levels that would freeze exposed skin in under a minute. Wind howled like a wounded beast, clawing at the research station's reinforced walls. Inside Medbay 4, Dr. Vellin adjusted his ocular visor and tapped through the interface of his diagnostic panel. The thermal readings outside were dropping rapidly. On the screen, a blinking red dot moved away from the station perimeter. Vellin narrowed his gaze. "Someone's outside," he said aloud. A technician nearby glanced up. "Could be a probe malfunction." Vellin tapped the console. "Negative. Biometrics confirm human. It's Marcus Kellan." The technician's face paled. "Marcus? Why the void would he go out now?" Vellin didn't answer. He was already moving, long limbs gliding over the floor, his white coat snapping behind him. He reached the external comms and activated the outbound channel. "Marcus Kellan, this is Dr. Vellin. You've breached the safety zone. Return to habitat immediately. Repeat, return immediately." Static. Then, faintly, Marcus's voice crackled through, distorted by interference. "There's someone out here. Kid. I saw movement near the ravine. Could be one of the survey team." Vellin's fingers twitched involuntarily. "You'll die out there. The temperature has dropped below survivable thresholds for your species. Return now." No, the signal broke again, then returned. "If it's a kid, they won't last. I'm already close." The channel went dead. Vellin stared at the receiver for a long moment. One of the research assistants approached, holding a thermal blanket. "He'll die," she said quietly. "No one survives out there without full gear." "He didn't even put on the heated boots," Vellin muttered. He turned and barked orders. "Prepare the trauma chamber. Alert surgical. We may be receiving a critical human patient." Marcus trudged through the snow, breath freezing on his beard. Every step was a battle. His gloved fingers barely functioned and he could no longer feel his toes. The emergency beacon on his wrist flickered. The ravine came into view, barely a depression in the whiteness. He scanned the edge. Nothing. He was about to turn back when a faint cry cut through the wind. He turned sharply. "Hello," he shouted, voice hoarse. A small hand emerged near a snowdrift, waving weakly. "Hold on," he called, stumbling toward the movement. It was a child, roughly 8 years old, face pale, lips blue. Marcus didn't recognize her. She must have been from the auxiliary transport that crashed a day ago. Search parties had assumed all survivors were accounted for. He dropped to his knees beside her. "What's your name?" She barely whispered. "Sarah." He wrapped her in his coat, pressing her to his chest. "Stay with me. We're going home." The wind slammed into them again. Marcus stood, teeth gritted, and began the long trek back, carrying her in both arms, shielding her as best as he could. Back at the station, tension thickened as the hours passed. Vellin monitored vitals from the beacon, watching Marcus's body temperature drop into dangerous ranges. Eventually, the signal vanished. "No pulse," the assistant whispered. Vellin's throat tightened. "Shuttles are grounded. We can't deploy recovery until the storm lifts. Then we wait." "No," Vellin said. "We prepare." When the storm finally eased, a shuttle launched. The recovery team found Marcus collapsed just 30 meters from the station entrance, curled around the unconscious child. Both were airlifted immediately. Marcus's body was hypothermic. His fingers and toes were dark, skin blistered and splitting. The medical scanner beeped ominously. "Multiple frostbite sites," Vellin muttered. "He's in stage 3. Necrosis possible." He moved fast, directing the surgical team into action. Human biology was fragile, yet somehow this man had carried another through lethal cold and made it back alive. They stabilized Marcus, but his condition remained critical. His breathing was shallow. Skin grafts would be needed. Possible amputation loomed. "Will he wake up?" the assistant asked. Vellin studied the vitals. "If his organs hold. But the damage is extensive." The child Sarah was in better condition. Mild hypothermia but no frostbite. She stirred within hours. "Where's the man?" she murmured. "In recovery," Vellin said gently. "Tell him thank you," she whispered. Marcus didn't wake for 3 days. When his eyes finally opened, Vellin was there, monitoring his vitals. "You're at Medbay 4, Vellin said. "You've suffered severe frostbite and hypothermia. We had to debride tissue from your feet and hands. You will require physical therapy for several months." Marcus blinked. "The kid? Alive?" "She asked about you." A weak smile ghosted across Marcus's face. "Good." Vellin hesitated. You risked your life. You knew the odds. Why? Marcus coughed. Because someone had to. There are protocols. Risk assessments. Fail-safes. You ignored them. I saw her out there. That was enough. Vellin didn't respond. He left the room and returned to the lab, disturbed. Weeks passed. Marcus remained in bed, bandaged and weak. He couldn't walk yet. Vellin assigned himself to the humans case, ostensibly for medical oversight, but truthfully, he was curious. He asked questions. What drove Marcus to act without certainty? What made him risk irreversible damage for someone he didn't know? Marcus always gave the same kind of answer. She was alone. You could have died. Yeah. But she didn't. Vellin had studied dozens of species. Most operated on self-preservation. Altruism existed, but rarely at such a cost. Marcus's behavior defied pattern. One evening after a painful therapy session, Marcus asked, "Why do you keep watching me like that?" Vellin folded his long arms. "I've seen many injuries, but rarely inflicted by choice." "I didn't choose frostbite," Marcus muttered. "You chose the risk." Marcus looked out the window. Snow still covered the plains. "I guess I did," he said. "But fear's not always useful. Sometimes compassion has to come first." Vellin didn't reply. He left the room and stood in the corridor for a long while, processing. When Sarah's parents arrived, they wept openly. Marcus watched from his bed, unable to move more than his upper body. "She wouldn't be here without you," her mother told him. He nodded slightly, throat too dry to speak. Later, Vellin reviewed the footage from Marcus's helmet cam. He watched the man stumble through whiteout conditions, carrying the child, whispering to her to stay awake. He watched Marcus collapse within sight of the station, arms wrapped tightly around her. The footage ended with a long silence, the screen fading to static. Vellin sat for a long time before saving the file under a new category, compassion-driven survival events. He added a note: "Fear calculates risk. Compassion defies it." Marcus's recovery was slow. Skin grafts took weeks to settle. He was fitted for mobility braces. Physical therapy sessions were grueling. At first, he couldn't even grip a fork. One morning, as Vellin adjusted the nutrient drip, Marcus winced. "Pain. Always? Would you do it again?" Marcus looked up. "Every damn time." Vellin said nothing. But that night, he found himself reviewing other cases. He began rethinking triage algorithms. He proposed a study to the medical council on the psychological factors behind self-sacrifice. He didn't tell them it was because of a man who limped into a frozen wasteland for a girl he didn't know. He didn't need to. The numbers were clear. But for once, the numbers weren't the point. Vellin had learned enough for now. The first time Marcus stood without support, it was 2 weeks after the blizzard. His knees buckled before he made it halfway across the rehab mat. One of the attendants caught him under the arm just before he collapsed. "Again," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "You're overreaching," said the assistant, a stocky Thalari with pale green fur and 2 elbow joints per limb. "You'll tear the grafts. I'll tear your clipboard if you don't let go." Vellin, observing from the side, made a note on the thin holopad balanced in his palm. Marcus had refused sedatives since regaining consciousness. He'd also refused the motorized exosuit twice. "Give him a break," Vellin said without looking up. "We need his skin to stay attached for at least another 40 hours. Marcus sat back on the padded bench, breathing hard. "If I wait that long, I'll forget how to walk." "You didn't forget. Your legs simply don't recognize you anymore." "Yeah, well, I'm working on the introductions." Vellin flicked his fingers, saving the logs to the central archive. "You're not required to push yourself at this frequency. I'm not doing it for fun." "I know." Marcus glanced over. "Do you?" Vellin didn't answer. He walked over and scanned the graft sites with a portable dermal scope. The edges were healing faster than expected. Human tissue had an infuriating way of defying projections. Marcus clenched his jaw as Vellin lifted his right foot and gently flexed the toes. "Still no feeling?" "Just a weird buzzing. Like someone plugged me into a loose socket." "That's nerve regeneration. Phantom stimulation. Sounds like a bad band name." Vellin stood. "You'll walk again. But you won't outrun anything. Didn't plan on sprinting through any more snowstorms." "Good. Because you would lose that bet." Marcus pulled on the fleece-lined sleeve of his therapy uniform. "You ever treated someone who walked back into a death zone before?" "Yes. Once." "And?" "They didn't come back." Marcus leaned back, eyes closed. "That's a hell of a track record." "It wasn't mine. I was still a student." Later that day, while Marcus slept, Vellin entered the diagnostics chamber and activated a restricted file, Neural Resilience Comparison, Cross-Species Study. He scrolled through the data until he reached the human section, then tapped into something labeled Spontaneous Sacrificial Behavior in Non-War Scenarios. The file was unfinished. He began filling it in. 3 days later, Marcus hobbled into the mess hall using a cane he'd carved himself out of scrap piping. It wasn't straight. It wasn't comfortable. But it worked. He took a tray and shuffled over to the least crowded table. A pair of Zarnik engineers at a far corner stopped eating when he sat down. One of them leaned in. "You're the one from the storm?" Marcus poked at his meal. "Apparently. You did that for a child?" She was freezing. The other engineer tilted his head, antennae twitching. "You weren't genetically bonded. No shared lineage. No prior contact." "Nope." "Then why?" Marcus looked at him. "Because I'm not a sociopath." The two aliens stared at him for a moment longer, then returned to their food. Vellin walked in just in time to catch the exchange. He watched Marcus for a moment, then turned and left without a word. At medical review 2 days later, Vellin was adjusting the calibration on a circulatory stimulator when Marcus grunted, "You planning to stare at my blood pressure all day, or are we gonna talk about the thing you're not saying?" Vellin didn't look up. "Which not said thing are you referring to? You've been watching me like I'm an unstable reactor. Just say what you're thinking." "I don't think you're unstable." "Really? I think you're anomalous." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be flattering?" "It's not intended as either insult or compliment. It's an observation." "Okay. Observe this. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't let a kid die in a snowbank." Vellin finally looked up. "But you did more than that. You endured systemic tissue degeneration, complete neuromuscular failure, and cellular liquefaction in your extremities. Your body began consuming itself for heat. And yet, you didn't stop. I already told you. You didn't stop even when your muscles were tearing. Even when your heartbeat dropped into arrhythmic collapse. Even when your organs started shutting down." Marcus stared at the ceiling. "So write it in your little paper. Human idiot refuses to die." "I already did. But I'm not satisfied with that conclusion." "You want a better quote? Try this. Sometimes you move because nobody else will." Vellin tapped something into his pad. "That's closer." By the 4th week, Marcus was walking without the cane. His fingers still couldn't grip tightly, but he'd managed to tie his own boots that morning, which he considered a victory. Sarah came to visit with her mother. The girl didn't say much. She just climbed onto the cot beside him and sat quietly, swinging her legs. "My dad says you're crazy," she said eventually. "Your dad's not wrong. He says we're moving to another station. One closer to the equator." Marcus nodded. "That's probably a good idea. I wanted to say goodbye." He looked at her, then ruffled her hair with his clumsy, half-healed hand. "You already did more than that." She smiled and gave him a drawing crayons on recycled paper. It showed a stick figure carrying another stick figure wrapped in a red blanket. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his rehab bag. That night, Vellin called into a closed session with the Ethics Committee of the Galactic Medical Consortium. He presented a case study without names, just data, metrics, and outcomes. One of the counselors interrupted. "Your conclusion is unsupported. You suggest that unpredictable altruism is a repeatable trait among humans. I suggest that preparedness for irrational compassion should be part of our hazard protocols when working with them." Another counselor frowned. "Are you proposing we model emergency response systems around acts of self-sacrifice?" "I'm proposing we stop assuming they'll act logically under threat." Silence. Eventually, one voice replied. "Noted." Back on the station, Marcus stood at the edge of the landing pad with a duffel over his shoulder. His transfer shuttle was due in 20 minutes. Vellin approached holding a small case. Marcus turned. "You came to say goodbye?" "No. I came to give you this." He handed over the case. Marcus opened it. Inside was a set of custom thermal gloves lined with microheaters and adjustable pressure nodes to assist with grip. "These are expensive. They're not a gift. They're a field test. I want reports weekly." Marcus smiled, not a grin, not a smirk, just a quiet curve of acknowledgement. "I'll write you poems." "Don't." They stood in silence for a moment as the wind picked up. Finally, Marcus said, "You ever going to stop trying to explain what happened?" "No." "Why?" Because if I do, I'll have to accept that we don't understand you at all. Marcus looked out at the horizon. Maybe that's the point. The shuttle landed with a hiss of compressed gas and a low whine of stabilizers adjusting to the platform. Marcus turned and walked toward it, steps slow but steady. Vellin didn't call out. He just stood there, watching the man disappear through the hatch, still rewriting everything he thought he knew about resilience and realizing it might never be enough. 3 months after the blizzard, Marcus stepped off the intra-colony tram at the Northern Medical Annex of Virella Station 2. He moved stiffly but without assistance. His gait was slightly uneven, the result of permanent tendon shortening in his left foot. But he no longer needed braces. The gloves Vellin had designed functioned well enough for most tasks, though assembling anything smaller than a pencil still felt like trying to thread a needle with boxing gloves. He wore them anyway. The annex was quieter than Station 4, more research than trauma, with biologists and xenogeneticists moving between labs in long robes that trailed like smoke. Marcus nodded at a passing technician with a cluster of nodules on her forehead. She glanced at his gloves, then lowered her eyes. Inside the main facility, a receptionist directed him toward a conference room near the back. He found Vellin there already, standing beside a wall display showing thermal imaging overlays of various humanoid species. The doctor didn't turn when Marcus entered. "You're early. I didn't want to risk missing the train," said Marcus. The last one smelled like fermented algae and someone's bad decisions. Vellin tapped the display, which shifted to a thermal scan of a human skeleton mid-stride. "You'll be giving a presentation." Marcus blinked. "I thought I was just here to answer questions." That was before the research board decided your case constituted a behavioral pivot point. You'll be interpreting your own data. Marcus dropped his duffel on the floor and sat at the long table. Interpreting? I didn't write any of this. And yet you lived it. 2 hours later, the room was filled. A tri-species panel of behavioral scientists took the front row. Behind them, a cluster of medical students and xenopsychology interns sat with notepads and neural recorders. Marcus stood at the front, one hand resting on the edge of the console to keep himself upright. "All right," he said. "Here's the short version. It was cold. I went out. Found a kid. Came back. Lost some skin. Got better. Any questions?" A Ilari student raised a tendril. "Why did you not request additional support before departing into the storm? Protocols exist for coordinated retrievals." There wasn't time. She would have been buried before anyone else got there. An older, six-eyed researcher leaned forward. "Did you experience mental dissociation during exposure? Hallucinations? Altered perception?" "Yeah. I kept hearing my mom yelling at me for forgetting my gloves in 3rd grade. Muted laughter spread through the room. Vellin stepped in. "You'll note the subject retained coherent memory throughout the incident. Cognitive degradation was delayed well beyond expected thresholds." Another hand shot up. "Mr. Kellan, do you believe your actions were driven by an evolved instinct for kin protection misapplied to an unrelated individual due to environmental stress?" "No," said Marcus. "I just didn't want her to die alone." The room quieted. One of the note-takers stopped typing. "I know you want a cleaner answer," Marcus added. "But it's not always about instinct or logic. Sometimes it's just gut. You see someone in pain, you move." A pause. Then Vellin turned back to the panel. "We've completed the neurochemical analysis. No elevated aggression markers, no signs of hormonal imbalance." His decision wasn't reactionary. It was deliberate. That's what matters. After the session, Marcus exited into the courtyard behind the annex. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered rock spires. He leaned against the railing, flexed his fingers, and winced when 2 of them locked for a moment before releasing. Vellin joined him a few minutes later, holding a thermal mug. "Your explanations were insufficiently academic," he said. "Yeah, I figured. And yet they were effective. The panel has approved inclusion of your case in the core ethics curriculum." Marcus turned. "You're serious? They want to frame it as a case study in emergent morality under duress. You'll be cited in over 400 educational modules." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Are they going to call me a hero?" "Not exactly. More like an anomaly with educational value." He nodded. "That's better. Less pressure." The next morning, Marcus underwent his final post-incident evaluation. A new medic, a young avian species with flickering vocal patterns, ran him through dexterity drills. He dropped the stylus twice, then managed to pick it up on the third try. Grip strength at 81%, she chirped. Nerve latency returning to baseline. Feels slower than that, he muttered. Your perception is adjusting. Neural recalibration often outpaces proprioception. He stared at her. Your brain thinks your hand works better than it does. Yeah, that sounds about right. Later that day, he met Vellin on the landing platform. I'm heading back to Earth for a while, Marcus said. They've got a new rehab center in Patagonia. Less ice, more penguins. You'll be missed, said Vellin. Will I? Buy at least 3 departments. Possibly 4. Marcus chuckled. Tell them not to make any more lectures about me. I'm not dead yet. Vellin handed him a small box. Inside was a re-engineered version of the glove, slimmer, more flexible, with built-in micro-stimulators. These are not a test, he said. They're yours. Marcus closed the box. Thanks for not giving up on me. I never started, Vellin replied. The shuttle lifted off 20 minutes later. Marcus watched the colony shrink beneath them, the spires of the medical annex fading into the snow. 2 weeks later, Vellin received a package. It contained a photo of Marcus standing waist-deep in a river, holding a fishing rod in one hand and a boot in the other. He was grinning. Beneath it, a handwritten note read, "Still alive. Still ridiculous. No penguins yet." Vellin placed the photo on his shelf beside the neural scan and the thermal gloves prototype. Then he opened a new file in the research archive. It was titled simply, "Anomalous Compassion, Case Closed."